So I'm going to try and lay sort of a bit of a framework that both Dr. Murat and Olivia Enos can then speak to. So what is the significance of the Olympics, especially the Winter Olympics, for the Chinese, given that they've already hosted this in 2008? And why is this a matter of concern at all? So the first thing to recognize is the significance of the Olympic Games in the Asian context and also in the authoritarian context. For Asian states, the Olympics have always been a sign that they have arrived, that they are transitioning to a higher, more important political level. And so, whether it was Tokyo in 1964, marking the end of the American occupation, Seoul in 1988, as South Korea enters the OECD, and of course, the Beijing Olympics in 2008 with that gigantic public display. China saying, we are now one of the top five economies. We are certainly a major power. Um, so the significance here of the Winter Olympics is that very few states in Asia have hosted more than one Olympics. Japan, of course, right now is hosting the 2020, now 2021 games. So it's done it three times, if you also include Nagano. So China is basically putting its marker down that while it's not going to host the Summer Games again anytime soon, it is going to host both the Summer 2008 and now the Winter Olympics. And then, as an authoritarian state, um, the Olympics have always been a matter of propaganda. We can wish that there was less politics at the Olympics, but the reality is these are enormous political opportunities, especially for authoritarian states to basically say, look at what we can do, look at what we can put on display, look at our prowess. So what are the problems, broadly speaking, with having the PRC hosting the Winter Olympics? Well, to begin with, there is a health issue here. We are talking about a potential super spreader event. Leaving aside the political issues of what I already said, what is China's incentive to call off or to limit access should there be a Delta, an Epsilon, or some other variant of COVID going on in 2022? Do we think that the Chinese authorities, who it seems pretty clear muzzled or otherwise discouraged dissemination of information at the beginning of the COVID crisis, would necessarily be willing to limit public participation? I mean, if we look at Japan, they've said no foreigners, no tourists, no audience. Do we think the Chinese would take such measures if they thought that they had a COVID issue? And in fact, the politics suggests that, in fact, they would go the other way, given how much they have tried to present themselves as having COVID entirely under control the entire time. Another aspect to consider here is data security. Thousands and thousands of attendees from around the world. That's a lot of biometric data. That's a lot of computers, tablets, cell phones. That's a huge amount of personal information, credit card information, all of that. And that is potentially going to be vulnerable because it will be accessed. The Chinese will expect that. You cannot get by in China without using increasingly digital commerce, e-commerce, financial technology, et cetera. So this is really a set of considerations, just broadly speaking, that we should be taking into account before we just willy-nilly say, okay, well, the International Olympic Committee granted Beijing, the 2022 Winter Olympics. I guess we have no choice in this matter. And finally, it is worth noting here, given the politics and the political lens, of China's increasingly assertive, increasingly aggressive approach, whether in politics or in news or in other aspects. Seems pretty clear that China's leadership believes that others will defer, that it can act with impunity, whether it is towards the Uyghurs, whether it is towards Hong Kong, whether it is of late, the last few weeks, towards Tibet. It can do anything it wants, and no one will say a word. And now it hasn't helped, of course, that the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, chose to ignore what is going on with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But for China to be able to, host the 2022 Winter Olympics with nary a word, no real reaction, that's sending a very, very problematic message. It raises real fundamental questions about what, if anything, would cause China to move off of its current path of human rights abuses. And really also, why would it mute any of its actions, whether towards Taiwan, whether in the South China Sea, whether even in space, and elsewhere, where China is acting increasingly assertively. So I wanted to lay that out as sort of a broad context. And let me hand the microphone, the virtual microphone, I guess, over to Dr. Murat to talk a little bit about the human factors and considerations at work here.
Thank you, Dean. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Heritage Foundation, for giving me this platform to speak today. I'm here today not as a professional activist, expert, or a scholar, but just as a daughter, as someone directly affected by this atrocity that are being discussed today against Uyghurs. Some of you might heard of my mother's name, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, a retired doctor who disappeared almost 3 years ago. September of 2018 when I last heard my mom's voice. She sent me a message saying I should sleep when the baby sleeps, referring to my then infant daughter. I haven't heard from her since. When she last visited the United States in 2016, she promised us she would come back soon. I waited for her to come back until the very last days of my pregnancy, but she couldn't be here because her passport was confiscated. After 3 months, I had my daughter. My mom disappears. Starting that day, I searched for my mother. My search for my mother began while holding my 3 months old baby. That little girl is now 3 years old, and she still hasn't met her grandmother. On her third birthday, a few months ago, she pointed at my mom's picture and asked, "Is she coming for my birthday?" In that moment, I choked as if something was in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to answer her because I don't know the answer to that question. For over 2 years, we have had no information whatsoever on why she was detained, her whereabouts, or her condition. But then in December 2020, we learned that she was sentenced to prison on fabricated charges in a sham trial. To this day, we still don't know much and have had no proof of life. She's not a famous scholar or a renowned intellectual, but her sacrifice for her family and her compassion for her people have been her honor, and her life is equally valuable to any. Although my mother herself was never politically active, she speaks fluent Chinese, having served Chinese society for her entire career. She was a doctor, she was a healer, but she still was swept into this genocide. This has been hard to deal with, and of course, it's a nightmare I wish I could wake up from. I have a supportive husband and a beautiful daughter. But since my mother's detainment, life seems like a painful waiting game full of anxiety and frustration. I lost count on how many sleepless nights I have spent waking up in the cold sweats. Someday, I don't want to wake up because I long to be able to see her, in my dream at least. Slowly, I have begun to realize the responsibility this placed upon me must be shouldered, because my mother's case is a very visible example of reality of what's happening to the Uyghur people. If someone like my mother can be so unrepentantly given 20 years prison sentence, which is clearly so preposterous when anyone looks at her case, then no one is safe. While she's languishing in prison, we are watching the international community debate on what should be non-negotiable. The Olympics should be an event that symbolizes the value of humanity and a hope for international community. But this is simply not the case with the Beijing Olympics. While they are tearing families apart, separating the American grandbabies from their grandmother. All we want is to see our families, loved one, live like a normal human being. Is that too much to ask? Thank you.
Excellent. I think, Gloria, am I supposed to speak now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, Siba, I caught the tail end of your comments, and I think that it touches everyone who hears your story, and even if they've never gone through that experience themselves, separation from a loved one and from a family member is incredibly heart-wrenching. I'm sorry to everyone that I was a little bit late. Uber and DC traffic got me once again. But I'm glad that we're able to be here to discuss a really important subject because as people all across the globe have spectated and tuned in to enjoy the Tokyo Olympics this summer, as we all know, there's a far more concerning Olympics that is just on the horizon, Beijing 2022, which we've been talking about so far. It's slated to be held next year in February, and the US and the international community, however, still have time to act. And for that matter, so do the business community, so do civil society, and so do journalists like yourselves. For one thing, there's no reason to think that it's too late to postpone and move the games. Tokyo was postponed in March 2020 when it was originally slated to be held in July 2020. Of course, we know that it was postponed all the way to this year. And that was within 4 months of when the games were originally supposed to be hosted. But at this point in time, we're 6 months out from the Beijing Olympics, which means that there's plenty of time for both the Biden administration, for Congress, and for the International Olympic Committee to get their act together to postpone the Olympics and move it to a more suitable host. Second, there's no reason for us to be repeating past historical mistakes. In Berlin 1936, of course, you had the Nazi regime hosting the Olympics. There were already early reports of the camps being in existence, although our full-scale knowledge didn't come until a little bit after the Olympics, but it was used to sanitize the image of a brutal Nazi regime. In Moscow in 1980, the US, in concert with other countries, made the decision to fully boycott the Olympics in 1980. But the boycott unfortunately didn't deliver the policy results that the boycott was over, and the purpose was to get the Soviets to pull out of Afghanistan, which they didn't do until over 10 years later. And then, of course, we all know in Beijing in 2008, that there were many rumors that were later confirmed of severe displacement as a result of the Olympics, people who were literally uprooted from their homes, of child labor that was used in the creation of some of the paraphernalia that was actually shared at the Olympics. And of course, we all remember the tainted milk scandal that was a feature alongside of the Beijing 2008 Olympics. Finally, there's no reason why American athletes need to be punished in our efforts to hold the Chinese accountable. I think dashing Olympic dreams really isn't the best way, in fact, to hold China accountable. And I think that because of the ineffectiveness of the boycott against Moscow in the 1980s, we shouldn't consider a full boycott as the right step. So that leaves us asking, what's the alternative when it's clear that something has to be done, that Beijing, in the face of having 1.8 to 3 million Uyghurs in political re-education facilities and carrying out ongoing, not historical, ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity, in the face of the CCP just recently having completely overthrown freedom in the Hong Kong context. And of course, in the face of the CCP covering up critical information in the lead up to the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the early days, this is clearly not a responsible international actors. Policymakers have options, and the American people have options. And I want to outline a few of those right now. First, for the US government. One, Biden administration should form an international bipartisan coalition to pressure the International Olympic Committee for the purposes of postponing and moving the games. The administration has said that it is a priority of theirs to work with allies on a range of foreign policy issues. And in fact, when it comes to Xinjiang, they've already acted in concert with allies like the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada to sanction key individuals who are responsible for carrying out this ongoing genocide. But there are other allies like Japan, Korea, Australia, and others around the globe who should form the basis of this international coalition in order to create political will to postpone and move the Olympics. The backup option, which I would say is a substantially less strong response, is that if you can't postpone and move the Olympics, then you should condition the participation of diplomats on transparency from the Chinese Communist Party. What I mean by that is that they shouldn't be allowed to participate. Diplomats should not participate unless we can actually gain access to the camps in order to provide relief to the people. And I think that that is really critical. There have been a lot of talks of a diplomatic boycott, but it needs to be conditioned. Any sort of participation should be conditioned on access to those camps. The second bucket of recommendations I have is for civil society. All throughout the Olympics, historically, athletes have engaged in various forms of protests, whether this was the American team deciding not to dip the flag at opening ceremonies, or individual teams or individuals who raised their fists in the face of apartheid to protest the apartheid being carried out by the South African regime. Athletes have options, and they should use all of them possible, not only American athletes, but athletes all across the globe, to demonstrate their solidarity with the suffering Chinese people. The second, and this applies really evidently to all of you who are on the line, is for journalists to speak up, to increase coverage on the severe human rights violations that the CCP continues to carry out on all fronts, whether against Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, various persons of religious faith, and otherwise. And then finally, the business community has a responsibility to act as well. For example, NBC could decide not to broadcast the games or not to broadcast the opening ceremonies, which we know are going to be a propaganda tool for the Chinese Communist Party. And different corporations may decide not to run ads during the Olympics, lest they should inadvertently profit the Chinese. So I think there's truly a role for every facet in society to be deeply engaged in responding to the Olympics, but the drumbeat needs to keep going. I think I'm so grateful to Gloria for organizing this as an opportunity for all of us to highlight the importance and to really clearly signal that Beijing should not be hosting the most prestigious sporting event in the world when they're carrying out ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity against the backdrop of all of these other human rights violations. So I'll just close there. But thank you again, Gloria, for organizing this, and also to Dean and to Ziba for sharing the virtual stage.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Ziba and Dean. Great remarks. So I just want to open the floor now. If there's any questions, just ask that you would unmute yourself and then identify yourself, and we'll go from there.
Hi there, this is Mike Martina from Reuters.
Hi.
Hey, I wondered, perhaps Dean or Olivia, if you could talk a little bit about the timeline for possible U.S. government action ahead of the Olympics. So far, we've seen the Biden administration really not do much to address the Olympic issue. And as you mentioned, there has been some speculation about a diplomatic boycott. If they are going to act, when should they roll that out? Should they do that now or closer to the Olympics? And should they be waiting until they can get every possible like-minded partner country on side, or should they be going ahead and setting an example at the risk of being possibly isolated politically? Just curious your thoughts on that.
I think U.S. leadership on this is really critical. So I think that whether or not we can get a huge coalition of countries together in order to press for postponing and moving, or we only have a handful of countries. I think that doing something at this point is better than doing nothing. And I think doing something sooner rather than later is certainly preferable. As I mentioned, in the Tokyo context, there was basically a 4-month lead up to when the Olympics were originally slated to be held. So I think that, time is of the essence for sure. But I don't think that if we get to, within 4 months of the Olympics, that like the Biden administration or Congress should use that as an excuse not to continue to press for postponing and moving or pursuing some other options. I don't think inaction is going to be possible for the Biden administration. I think that they're going to have to come out with a statement, especially given how much activity we have seen in Congress on this front. And I would suspect that given that we're now, almost past the Tokyo Olympics, that the pressure is only going to heighten on the administration for them to have answers about what their response will be.
Let me just add a couple of thoughts here. First is that never underestimate the power of the catalyst. Everyone is typically going to be happy to sit around and let somebody else take the lead. And that's a great excuse for not doing anything at all. But once someone takes the lead, you are putting down a marker. And we have seen, for example, with the EU that there are significant voices there that are very unhappy with what is going on with Chinese policy towards the Uyghurs, and to the extent that it has even affected direct business transactions, such as the CAI, the investment agreement. So there clearly is a mood out there to not give Beijing an opportunity to basically wriggle out from underneath its responsibilities. So it's important to capitalize upon this. Not taking advantage of it arguably loses a lot of the momentum that's already there. And something to think about here, while the probability is very low, a significant number of states demonstrating that they are going to take action might, in theory at least, cause Beijing to actually back down, or at least make some kind of effort to try and ameliorate things, whether it is releasing 1 or 2 people, whether it is providing additional information about the whereabouts of at least some of the people who are being held prisoner. It would allow people like Ms. Murat to have some better idea of what has happened to their loved ones. And given that 2022 is an important political year in China, with a major party Congress that is supposed to endorse Xi Jinping staying in power for another 5 years, putting pressure on at this time before those Olympics may actually generate some countervailing pressure within the Chinese system to sort of say, hey, is this worth this kind of pressure? Or, given the catalyst involved here, is it worth maybe at least a fig leaf of paying attention to world opinion?
Thanks, Michael. Anybody else?
I can ask one more if you don't mind.
Please go for it.
Great. I'm just, I'm curious in light of COVID, when probably fewer heads of state or senior officials are likely to travel, abroad for the Olympics anyway, if you think there's a risk that even some countries that are perhaps sympathetic to the Uyghur cause could walk a diplomatic kind of a thin line where they don't attend, but don't openly say they're not attending because of the Xinjiang situation. And if that's a risk, if there are going to be a number of countries that could just somehow avoid annoying Beijing, but also kind of escape the issue altogether by simply just not talking about it and not showing up.
That's a really creative thought there. I think that you're probably right. I don't know exactly what Dean covered in his comments, but I I think that COVID could serve as a really good excuse for people to decide not to participate in Olympics in Beijing. I think it would be subpar, obviously, for them not to say that also the human rights concerns for how Beijing is carrying itself is another factor in why we wouldn't participate. And I would think that for like EU countries, for UK, for Canada, hopefully for other allies in Asia, that they would make clear that it was also over human rights concerns as well. But I could definitely see diplomats wriggling out of that dilemma that it may or may not put them in to make a public statement and use COVID as an excuse. But Dean, maybe you have a better answer on this.
Not a better answer. What I would just observe is that absolutely Beijing will use that as the argument, no matter what. Anyone who doesn't show up, be it an athlete, be it a diplomat, be it a public figure of any kind, entertainers, the Chinese will simply say, "Oh, it's because of COVID, the epsilon, the rho, the omega variant, whatever it is by that point." So the question is in part going to be whether or not anyone else will buy that spin. And that's going to be partly also up to journalists to discuss as well, to highlight whether, oh, well, it's probably just because of COVID, or whether it is, in fact, because there are open human rights violations that are underway. And holding China's feet to the fire is partly the role of diplomats. Ask those hard questions of the Chinese, and also, frankly, of both the diplomats and the athletes. Why are you not going? Does it matter that there are, millions of people behind barbed wire fences?
And I just wanted to add here, this might seem a little off topic, but I promise that it's not. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity, pre-COVID, to visit the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And at that time, they were running a fabulous exhibit called Americans in the Holocaust. The exhibit essentially documented how different Americans or groups of Americans responded in the face of the Holocaust. The early reports, in many of them carried by journalists of Kristallnacht or of the concentration camps. And the strength of the exhibit is in highlighting like the different roles that various members of society play in bringing to light severe human rights violations. And journalists played a really critical role, as did student groups. And their outspokenness in many ways led to US government action. And one of the things that really stood out to me from this exhibit was that there was a lone Jewish member of FDR's cabinet, Henry Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time. And because he cared so deeply about the Jewish people, especially European Jewish people who were facing such persecution by the Nazis, he single-handedly, and I hesitate to say single-handedly because it was clearly, it had to do with the fact that the American electorate too was so outspoken in their opposition, in no small part because of journalists shedding light on the severe atrocities that were taking place at the hands of the Nazi regime. But Henry Morgenthau convinced the president to create the War Refugee Board that led to the resettlement of hundreds of thousands of European Jews within American borders, American Jews or European Jews who might have otherwise perished inside of the Nazi concentration camps. And so I just sort of say this as an exhortation that we all each as individuals have responsibilities to speak out, and the Olympics give us a great opportunity, I think, to shed light on how the CCP is carrying out these modern day atrocities that we really thought were relegated to the dustbins of history. And unfortunately, they've been pulled out of the dustbin and reused and re-envisioned, reimagined by the CCP. And so I think it really does call us all to act and to speak out boldly where we can.
Wonderful. We are running on time here, so thanks, folks, for joining. Really appreciate it. Thanks to Olivia, Ziba, and Dean for your comments. Really appreciate it. If y'all have any follow-up questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. You should have my email at this point if I haven't spammed you enough already. But with that, we'll release y'all and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.